Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Joe from the HealthXL team. As you already may be aware, HealthXL connects leaders across the world to solve health challenges. We have a thriving clinical trials innovation community that discusses decentralized clinical trials using digital measures and all other aspects of innovation in the clinical trial space. So today we brought together an incredible group to tell us more about this transformation of clinical trials through the story of Science37. During the webinar, please feel free to post questions on the chat box. Before we get started, I think it'll be great to do a quick round of rapid fire intros, maybe with name, title, and even a fun fact about you. Jeremy, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So thank you for being here today. I'm Jeremy Sohn. I'm a partner at Magnetar Capital, and I spent the last decade or more focused on innovation within life sciences. First as a venture capitalist, then in parallel as an entrepreneur, having started a couple of companies focused on innovation and business model transformation within life sciences, and then spent some time, a fabulous 5 years at Novartis, leading and driving innovation there. And then most recently joined Magnetar Capital to help build out their private healthcare investment strategy and platform. So great to be part of this panel.
Thanks, Jeremy. Neil, off to you.
Thanks, Joe. Nice to meet everyone. Neil Tiwari. I'm based out in San Francisco on the West Coast. I am also a partner at Magnetar Capital, co-leading our efforts in building out a life sciences health technology fund. Historically, for the last 6 years, I was at Novartis on their venture team as managing director, which is where I met David and the Science37 team. Been a board member at Science37 for almost 5 years now. So excited to share more about our learnings over the last few years.
Thanks, Neil. I'm sure everyone is excited as well. David.
David Coman. I'm the CEO of Science37. I guess from a fun fact perspective, I spent most of my career, or actually the first decade of my career outside of industry, working on everything from AT&T to Xerox, and got into the life science space about 20 years ago, a company called Dendrite, where I was chief marketing officer, then Quintiles as chief marketing officer, and then more recently as the head of strategy over at a company called ERT. I came here to Science37 to lead the company into its new path in November of 2019. So I've been here for about 2.5 years now.
Thanks, David. Thank you for those intros, gentlemen. I think without further ado, I will leave the floor to the three of you to take us through the story of Science37.
Great. David, maybe to kick us off, maybe you could provide a little bit of context. Even before you talk about Science37, provide a little bit of context of what are decentralized clinical trials? Why are they important? Why is it you can't almost read an article today in sort of the fierce whatever circulation you receive in your daily email about the importance of decentralized clinical trials for patients or for the pharma community?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So if you think about the way clinical research has been done for the last 60 to 90 years, depending on where you start, pretty much it runs the same course. You have a sponsor, a clinical trial sponsor, usually a drug company, who sets up a network of sites around the world. So those sites usually are clinics or hospitals. Each of those sites have their own people, processes, and technology in order to be able to find the patients, pull the patients through, matriculate them through, ultimately gather the data for clinical evidence. Now, a big issue in the whole structure, of course, is about getting enough patients and enrolling them as fast as possible. But two important fun facts here. First one is that only about 3% of providers today participate in clinical research because it's such a burden to do so. And then the second fun fact is that only about 8% of anyone with a condition is ever approached about joining a clinical trial. And the reason for that essentially is the first, which is with such a scarcity of providers who are interested and capable of doing it, and the model that restricts, participation to a geographic location around those individual providers it really limits the number of patients that actually can participate. So anyway, that's sort of the big background on the way clinical research has been done. The concept around decentralization really means finding patients outside of those clinics and enrolling them without a brick and mortar dependency. And so now it's a little ironic because on one sense, you have the traditional model where you have this dispersed network of clinical trial sites around the world going and finding the patients, and that's called traditional. And then you have another model where you centralize all of those people, processes, and technology to be able to go find those patients wherever they are, and we call that decentralized. So it's a little bit ironic, but that is the nomenclature that we're using today.
David, just playing off of your last comment there, do you have a favorite term? If you could rename that, decentralized clinical trials, would you stick with decentralized clinical trials, or would you try to name it something different?
I'd probably take something in the realm of patient centricity to utilize it from a nomenclature perspective, because what you're really doing is you're taking elements from this dependent brick and mortar infrastructure and finding patients directly and reducing the patient burden throughout the clinical trial. So probably something around there. But the term that we continuously use at Science37 is agile clinical trials, which is a little bit of a permutation of that, and we could probably go into it a little bit more depth. But I think we live in a world where it's not a black and white situation where you have to make a decision, a binary one, where you're going to go traditional or decentralized or whatever you call it. And it's really an amalgamation of the two. We'll talk about that a little bit more further.
Well, if you don't mind, I'd love to pull in Neil here on that context, because I think there were a lot of learnings that Neil had along the way around that specific question around how we're on that pendulum of decentralization or agility. Do we, can you find yourself? So Neil, what were your experiences and learnings?
Sure. I think the thesis when we first made the investment in the company back in 2015 was really focused on that first term, decentralization. And at that time, decentralization meant fully virtual. And that's how the company originated. That's how it started. And I think after the first 2 to 3 years, what we learned was more important than being fully virtual was being flexible. That the flexible model is really what would allow growth and scale for our customers. And really what that meant was flexible from the perspective of not being as focused on ensuring that 100% of the trial activities are being done at home, but ensuring that you make it as easy as possible for patients. And I think David hit the nail on the head when he said patient centricity. Because at the end of the day, what you're really trying to do is make it as easy as possible for them to engage, for them to stay within the trial itself. And that is, that culminates in a variety of things. I'd probably just hit on 2 or 3 items. One is making it easy for them to be found, number one. Like, how do you engage with them and bring them into the trial? Number 2, once you have them within the trial, what are you doing to ensure that they are being retained within the trial itself? Like, what aspects of it are you doing that are truly virtual? As an example, telemedicine visits that allow you so you don't have to go into a physical site. Bringing care to the patient's home, whether it's mobile phlebotomy, whether it's mobile nursing, or arranging an Uber for them to go to a Quest lab to be able to get their blood work done for more advanced or more imaging, as an example. And so I think that the realization was the flexibility is really what drives patient retention. It's also what drives acceptance within the pharma community, because a lot of the challenges early on had to do with how can you ensure that the data that you're collecting at home is validated? How do you know that the endpoints that you're collecting in a telemedicine mechanism are equivalent to an in-person? And so that kind of shift from a purely virtual model to a more flexible model where certain aspects are done at home and other aspects are done virtual, and that it's flexible within a trial, that certain trials are going to be 80% virtual and 20% hybrid, where other trials might be 50-50. And it was that transition, which was right around the time when David came on board and really fulfilled that vision.
Very cool. That's a point that I'm going to want to come back to, because what I hear you saying, both Dave and Neil, is that you had this vision early on around patient centricity, that to solve for some of the problems that you mentioned, the fact that we don't get enough people participating in clinical trials, that enough providers aren't participating in clinical trials, and it's too hard and too complicated to participate. And then the ideal solution, which is let's eliminate a lot of the need to go places. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think I've heard in the past that on average, it takes something like 2 hours for an individual to participate in a clinical trial site. And I don't know about you, but I think your life is probably similar to mine. Is who has 2 hours in the day, to spend, certainly not in the usual 3 hours that they give you, for your, on a Friday afternoon to be available. And so I hear that that's the one problem. And then the second problem is now if you were to move the clinical trial closer to the home, which is what I believe is the vision for Science37, closer to the community, if you will, maybe even into the home using virtual tools, that it's not an all or nothing, right? That finding the right balance has been part of the journey. Is that right?
I think so. I mean, a little personal story here. I mean, the first clinical trial visit that I was able to observe, this is many, many years ago now, but it was in coastal Carolina. I went to a clinic. I got to meet a patient who traveled, to the site with his wife. So Frank and Eleanor, they went through the procedures and the informed consent, and they were explaining what to expect through the clinical trial. I asked him where he came from, and he said from Fayetteville. We did a little map quest. That was a 2 hour and 15-minute drive for him to get to that facility. Now, what I didn't mention is that Frank has Parkinson's disease. And so he also learned in that visit that he was going to have to go to that facility every month for his checkup and procedures. And so, think about what we're doing to this poor man and his wife, who's going to have to travel with him every single time, in terms of the burden that we create. Think about Parkinson's, think about MS, think about all forms of cancer. This is an incredible burden that we're putting on people. And so if you can take the burden of having to travel in order to do each of those visits away and set it up in a manner where you're facilitating a conversation just like we're having today. I mean, this is through a Zoom platform, but taking all that travel time out of the picture, and really the laborious task of having to do that if you happen to be a super sick patient, and then bringing it to them. So you either have a telemedicine visit like we're doing sort of here today, but you also can have a nurse coming into the home. We're doing trials today where we're doing infusions in the home for rare forms of cancer. We're doing a 60-hour infusion for a postpartum depression trial. And just think about what we would be making them do in a world where we're forcing everything into brick and mortar. And so it really is transformative in terms of the patient side. But also, if you go back to that core idea that I started with, which is 92% of patients are never even asked about joining a clinical trial. 92%. And so you start then questioning the ethics around the way we actually do clinical research today. Why, if you know that you can actually invite anyone to participate in a virtual manner, why wouldn't you invite anybody to be able to do that? And I think that, we really open up the door to making that all happen.
Great. And so just what I heard you say is that part of the model for Science37 is to use technology and to use patient centricity to rethink some of the structure of a normal clinical trial, and where you may have required a site visit to collect bloods, or other sort of diagnostics, to the extent that now you can move that to a virtual interaction that A, makes it more efficient, B, makes it easier, C, maybe even be more cost effective in terms of the overall cost of that interaction. Is that, and what else is Science37 doing? Is A, did I get that right? And B, when you think about the typical study for Science37, what does that look like?
Yeah, just the first comment on the virtual visit. So yeah, I mean, it could be a fully virtual visit, or you could have a patient getting treatment from the comfort of their own home, or we could be sending a patient to a local facility in order to be to get some procedures done. And so we have a massive trial with thousands of patients right now that requires a colonoscopy to take place. And so, we're sending a phlebotomist to the patient's home in order to get a blood draw. We're doing all the ePro capture through, telemedicine conversations, but we're also sending the patients into a local facility in order to get that colonoscopy done. And so it really brings the trial to the patient where they are. And so, getting maximum participation, easing the burden of participation. And so then if you think about the different types of models that, to your second question, that we've deployed, of course, we can fully virtualize the clinical trial. Another very popular solution for us is what we call a meta site, or a virtual site. And so our sponsors will set up a network of clinical trial sites around the world, just like they always have. And then they deploy Science37 as an extension, so a virtual site that fills in all the white space between them. And so it's an interesting model because it enables you to do what you've always done, and it enables you to take advantage of this new model. And by the way, whenever we do that, we're at least the highest enrolling site in the network, if not doing 50%, or in some cases 90% of the total trial. Then it becomes the different hybrid permutations or agile permutations, as we've been saying, where a patient may be initiated at a clinical trial site, and then a traditional clinical trial site, and then the subsequent visits could be done at home. There's other trials where we initiate them virtually, and then we send the patient into a community provider in order to get procedures done. There's other studies where, particularly in the rare disease space, which I think is really interesting, part of the problem in the rare disease space is just finding any patient. And so you have to set up a mass network of investigative sites in order to be able to pull that off. Well, what we're doing is we're identifying individual patients through, this case, a partnership with Foundation Medicine. We're going back to the community provider, and we're asking that community provider if they would participate as an investigator in the clinical trial. We're onboarding that investigator. And then from that point on, we're utilizing our operating system to be able to enable that community provider to be an investigator and to manage that patient relationship for the rest of the trial.
I love it. For those, and it's not, I don't know how familiar our audience is with Decentralized and some of the operating constraints. So if you don't mind, let me fill in some of the details here. And Dave and Neil, correct me if I get some of this wrong. But if you think about your typical clinical trial, let's just think, most clinical trials are global clinical trials, so they're run across the, anywhere from, let's say, 3 or 4 countries to as many as 30 to 60 countries. And then if you think about in any one country, you may have anywhere from, again, 10 sites to 30 sites. And in a country like the United States, even 30 to 60 sites still only gets to maybe 1 site in each state. And so that's the reason why you begin to see some of these complexities and travel times and also like limitations in terms of your reach into the communities. And so part of the theory that I hear from you around Science37 again is that we can alleviate the cost, the complexity, the lack of, I would say, even diversity and being able to reach beyond certain logical locations by being able to decentralize, sometimes virtualize, create hybrid or agile models to be able to reach deeper into the communities. Did I get that all right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome.
And I think,
Go ahead.
sorry, yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's one piece that David mentioned do just want to make sure that we really highlight, which is that operating system component, which is when you think about a clinical trial, we put the patient at the center. That's kind of the view. And then there's a lot, it requires a village to execute a clinical trial, right? The investigator that David mentioned, the nursing capabilities, the physicians, the pharma company, right? That entire circle of everyone that's involved. The idea is to create a technology platform, an operating system that seamlessly makes that experience easy for everyone. Obviously, we've really focused on the patient because that's the core of executing a clinical trial. But at the same time, everyone else that's involved, and I think that was a kind of a key learning in this evolution of creating an operating system that was flexible and easy to use for every individual actor within the execution of a clinical trial and making that as easy as possible. So the operating system spans not just the patient, but it spans everything from the recruitment process to the patient, to the investigator, to the data collection, and eventually getting that data back to the pharma company in a seamless kind of ecosystem. And it's that entire technology that sits across all of that that really is what Science37 innovated on over the last several years.
That's right. And it's working. And so if you look at the, patient recruitment stats, we say up to 15 times faster. We've got a case study right now that, we're doing it 20 times faster. And we have a trial right now where the average patient, I actually kind of like the point that you made a second ago, Jeremy, too, which was, the number of sites you have to get up in order to get the patient count. We have a large global study where the average patient count per month is 6.1 at each individual site. So each site is enrolling about 6.1 patients per month. We're enrolling about 70. And so just from a magnitude standpoint, in terms of our ability to go find patients faster, huge. Second area is about patient retention. And so the patients who come to a Science37 study don't leave. Our retention rates are up to 20% higher than what they are on a traditional clinical trial model. Particularly good for another model, which is called long-term follow-up. And so think about a trial where you have all these parent studies coming off, where they're managed by sites. The sites don't want to deal with those long-term follow-up patients. They ship them to Science37 and we manage them, over the course of years. And then the third area was mentioned earlier, but I think we should highlight it. It's about diversity. And if you take a look at the average study in a brick and mortar setting, it has about a third of the diversity that it should. And if you take a look at a Science37 run study, the population looks just like about the real population. And that's because we're able to go get patients from anywhere. And so we're tapping into the rural communities, we're tapping into all the diverse patient populations. And it's not just a social issue, it's really a scientific issue. You have to have the right patient profile who are going to be commercially taking that drug in the clinical trial.
So I love that you highlighted speed and retention and diversity. Many of those are important for the pharma companies. Equally true, those are important for patients. So tell me, what is it about the Science37 model that makes it more attractive or more meaningful or easier for a patient to participate and want to stay engaged and to feel more comfortable, being part of it, a clinical trial?
Yeah, I mean, we take the travel out of it. So most of the activity is done from the comfort of your own home. We sit in your pocket. Most of the activity that takes place is through interactions with a coordinator or with your investigator. And that is all done on an app that sits on your phone. And so we're right there in your pocket all the time. So it makes it super easy for you to get in contact with the right people in order to maintain your therapy. I mean, just think about the one trial I talked about earlier, where it's a 60-hour infusion. Would you want to do that if we had to send you into an hospital? Maybe not. Would you be willing to do that if you did that, from the comfort of your own home? Well, we're seeing that is certainly true. And so just, there's a physical barrier and an emotional barrier, I think, by going into a facility in order to participate. And I think we take that all away.
And
The other
Jeremy,
question,
just
sorry, go ahead. Neil.
I was just going to offer one other item, which was there's a question in the Q&A that's actually super relevant to what we're talking about right now. I'm sure I wasn't sure if you'd seen that, but it's not always a one size fits all decision for what you do, when you employ mobile nursing or when you employ mobile phlebotomy. It really depends on, and as mentioned in the question, it really depends on kind of the cost and where the ROI makes sense. And so thought we could just dive into just that one question, given the relevance to this topic, which was, and I don't know if you saw the question, David, it was some of the DCT solutions are currently more costly than having the patient visiting a site. For instance, home nursing. What are your views in demonstrating the ROI of DCT solutions today? And I think that gets to the speed and flexibility comment you made. So I thought we could just take a second on that.
Yeah, well, on the very lowest end of the spectrum, if you take 3 months of time, commercial time for your drug, very lowest end, it's $54 million of cost savings, of opportunity cost, if you will, if your trial is delayed. It's more typically in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So how much?
David, I just want to make sure people understand opportunity cost. You mean basically time to market for commercial sales. So you're accelerating the time to market, which is what you're equating with opportunity cost. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So 3 months, $54 million. $54 million. That's the lowest end of the spectrum. So if you're able to shave that off, was it worth it to you? I mean, it should be at minimum worth $54 million. And so if you want to compare, widget to widget, then that's one way of looking at it. But if you're actually looking to accelerate your clinical trial, you need to be looking at something like this because it does. Now, it's not always the case that a decentralized trial solution is more expensive, and sometimes it's actually even less expensive. But I think that you've got to come back to the core idea of what do you need to accomplish in a clinical trial. You have to be able to have data that is clear and efficacious. You have to have compliance in the process, but you have to get it done as soon as humanly possible because that all gives you the knock-on effect for a commercial environment. And it also reduces your costs if you can kill the drug faster, assuming it doesn't work.
David, I'm curious, and thank you for highlighting, because I think this is an important question, is that ROI could be measured in a lot of different ways. And so using your terminology, widget to widget, it may be that getting nurses or phlebotomists to go to the home is more expensive than having none of that cost and just having the individual go to the site. But in the totality of the system, right, the total trial may be actually cheaper, as well as the opportunity cost, because the trial was run faster, or maybe you got better retention. You could have fewer number of potential patients needing to be even enrolled in the study. And so therefore, again, the overall speed and cost might be cheaper. And so there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat, and sometimes it's not exactly obvious to be able to identify where those cost savings, where those efficiencies or improvements are. Is that fair?
That's fair. I'd also point out the counter cost to the traditional trial system, which requires clinical trial monitors to be flown all over the world in order to be able to make sure each of those individual sites are compliant and consistent in recruiting patients. And that entire cost structure is eliminated on a fully decentralized clinical trial.
Yeah, I remember when I first got into the space a decade ago, one of the things that was intriguing to me is that when we statistically size studies, you almost have a doubling effect based on every 10% failure of either attrition or, for that matter, persistence to the actual protocol. And so, if you factor into your sizing of your study and you assume, whatever it is, 40% of the patient population, or 20 to 40% of your patient population will drop out, and 20 to 40% of the patient population won't follow the protocol. All of a sudden, you went from a study that was at 100 to a study that was closer to, call it, 700. And the statisticians on this call should hopefully forgive me for my broad generalizations, but you can begin to see that if if a decentralized or an agile clinical trial model can begin to move those numbers, not just faster at recruitment, but actually less attrition and better persistence to protocol, you may actually end up improving the sizing of your studies as well, which again impacts cost and speed. Is that fair?
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Cool.
And I think just one other piece, just to wrap up that ROI question, because I saw a comment back just now come in around agreeing that DCT can improve recruitment timelines, but the question was, this individual hasn't seen a case where that's been demonstrated, and I think we can obviously provide some data for that. And some publicly available data that we have. So like as an example, that trial that David mentioned around the kind of oncology diagnostic trial. David, you can obviously dive into this example a bit more, but in that particular example, we were going head to head against more of a traditional model, against a more traditional kind of brick and mortar CRO type model in that example. And from what I recall, we were able to recruit and execute, more than 5,000 patients within the order of a couple of months, right? In comparison to the traditional brick and mortar setting. And maybe you can use that example a bit to offer an example on the reduction of timelines.
Yeah, in that case, there's, it was a biotech company that did what the biotech companies usually do. They signed up a CRO to be able to stand up site network. They stood up a site network of about 199 sites are in the country. This is US only study. After the first 2 months of enrollment, they had less than 200 patients enrolled in the trial. The problem is they needed 14,000. And so they were looking at a really, really long haul. So, we just did a quick postal code lookup around each of the sites and identified that it only represented about 1% of the total patient population in the States. So we said, well, why don't we fill in the 99% of the rest of the population? Now, in comparison to that, first 2 months of enrollment where they had 200 patients enrolled, our first full month of enrollment, we had 2,000. So just a massive magnitude. This trial wouldn't be done without Science37 participating. And I'll give you another example. This is in the COVID space. And this is a very similar profile in that, excuse me, profile in that they set, the sponsor in this case set up a network of sites. In this case, it was 25 and they expanded that to 50 eventually. The total N that they were looking for is about 490 patients. We hit go. Science37 enrolled 427 of those 490 patients. And so if you continue to follow the traditional site route, think about how long it would have taken to get that trial done. Think about how many additional sites you would have had to open up in order to make sure that you had the number of sites available to get the patient counts that you wanted. 85% of all clinical trials are delayed. And the number one cause of delays is patient enrollment. And so, if we think that the traditional model is the right way to go into the future, and you're willing to accept 85%, delays, I guess that's okay. But, in a world where that you can, the opportunity cost is $54 million for 3 months of delay, you probably ought to take a look at alternative models to be able to fulfill your patient counts.
So there were a couple of questions that came in around, I'm going to summarize or simplify the questions, but are there kinds of trials or therapeutic areas where decentralized clinical trials are a better fit or a less good fit? And maybe both of you, because I know David, I'd love to hear your answer, and Neil, you and I were in the middle of it, for many years as well at Novartis. So I'd love to get both of your guys' perspectives on it.
Yeah, Neil, you want to?
Yeah, after you. Go for it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I love it because that was the thing that I kind of wrestled with the most when I first, was looking at Science37 to, take the CEO role, and as I got on board, And it's interesting because I was told back in the day that Science37, fully decentralized model could never be used for an oncology trial. And yet that's our number one area, a number one therapeutic area. Of course, more trials are happening in oncology than anywhere else, but I think it's easier to talk about what can't be done in a decentralized model than where it best applies. Because with an agile lens, I think that you start thinking about how to use more of these techniques within the trial to gain speed, retention, and diversity, and reduce patient burden. So the areas where we stay away from are phase 1 trials, because if it's first in human, we believe that should be done in a hospital setting for all the right reasons. If it is a trial where there are procedures that need to be very precise and measured across every visit, then you probably want to go to a traditional site model. We've been asked to mix the IMP right at the point of injection, and we've said we don't think we should be doing that in a home-based setting because we can't promise sterility. But outside of that, having the flexibility to be able to initiate in a traditional site and then do the visits at home, or the flexibility to initiate the patient virtually and then send them to a local clinic in order to get procedures done, it really takes away that variability that clears out any of the therapeutic areas. So, we're doing everything, across the gambit right now.
And I think historically, to just chime in, Jeremy, and this was kind of our experience, when we were here in the early days, which was the vast majority of trials were dermatology, right? And it was primarily because the company was set up and the mechanism was set up to be 100% virtual. And it's really hard to do, therapeutic areas that that are quite frankly more complex, that have more risk, when all you're trying to do is a 100% virtual model. And so a lot of our early trials back in the 2015, 2016, 2017 days were dermatology, some diabetes as an example, trials that had a different risk profile, as well as a different mechanism, what I would say is a mechanism where you could do endpoint measurement in a fully virtual mechanism. And I think the flexibility that's been added and what I would call the full stack technology solution that engages all participants within the trial ecosystem has really expanded the ability, for the most part, other than what David mentioned as what can we not do. That's the ocean that we have now, which is we can pretty much do everything other than a couple of exceptions, as opposed to what it used to be, which was we couldn't do the majority of therapeutic areas. We could only do these 2 or 3 areas, and that's kind of been a fundamental transition within the company and within just the industry overall.
As a team that was helping drive innovation, right, early in this evolution, I remember, just from my perspective, is that we tried sort of the model number 1, where we tried to say, hey, let's almost force fit this into pharma, into the system. And it assumed trying to do what Neil said, is this is trying to find the perfect therapeutic area, the perfectly designed study. And what we found is it just didn't work, right? We had the right solution, we had the right concept, we had the right vision, but we were almost approaching it, not so much top down, but we were approaching it from one direction. And what I loved about your transition is you said, hey, wait a second, David, and you said this really beautifully just a minute ago, where you said, it's not about any one therapeutic or any one trial. It's about understanding the components within this study to be able to figure out where does this model apply, right? And that it's not about everything. It's about agility. Neil, your comment around agility, figuring out where can you apply these best constructs. But that took time, right? I remember saying that our issue then was as we made that transition or that realization, then we needed to think about how do we design the studies almost from the outset with the understanding that we could take this particular need and convert it into a virtual orientation as opposed to, or call it a decentralized virtual orientation as opposed to the normal model. But that took 3-4 years to, or 5 years to even to get us there. Cool. I want to be mindful of time and maybe shift us to the present. And we'll come back to some of the additional questions. So if you're still have questions, please post them. We'll come back to them towards the end. You just said a year ago, roughly, you went through a SPAC process. Maybe you could, David, you could give us a little bit of history around why SPAC? Like, what were you trying to achieve? What were some of the learnings, et cetera? And what is a SPAC, if you don't mind? Maybe we should even start there for those that don't know.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to cover that part, or do you want Neil? Do you want to cover that?
I can start maybe with just the high level, because I was part of the financing committee where we were kind of deciding which direction we wanted to go. And maybe just for the audience, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept, but SPAC stands for Special Purpose Acquisition Company, which is effectively a shell organization that is used to merge with a target company to take that target company public. And as part of that process, there are two components to getting financing for the company. Component one is what's called the SPAC trust, which is the SPAC itself is listed as a publicly traded company on its own, and the trust has a dollar amount that was raised as part of that process. SPAC trusts can range anywhere from, on the smaller end, 75 million up to, we've seen SPAC trusts greater than 500 million in size. And that's basically component one of the SPAC. Component two of the SPAC process is typically once the SPAC has identified a target, it goes through a merger process with that target. And as part of that, you can raise additional capital in the form of what's called a PIPE, which is private, which is effectively a private placement of additional capital that combines with the capital that's already in the trust. And at the point when the company goes public, you have access to both pieces of those capital. I think the one unique piece, or the one element that's worth mentioning, and I think we'll talk a little bit about why we chose the SPAC that we did, which is there's, as mentioned, there's the purpose of joining with the SPAC is to take a company public, number one. Number two, it's getting access to capital and getting access to enough capital for operating, for M&A, for effectively the strategy of the company. And I think the one piece that's important to know is that the capital that's part of the SPAC trust has the ability to be redeemed. And so the SPAC trust holders can essentially take their capital out at the point of when the company goes public. The only guaranteed capital that the company gets is the capital that was raised during the PIPE process. I know this is a little complicated, but that's an important construction element for how you think about a SPAC and how we made the decision to merge with the SPAC that we chose. So just a little history on the SPAC. And then maybe, David, you can talk a little bit about your process as you were going through kind of, as we were all going through kind of making a decision there.
Yeah, I mean, we chose the direction we did because it was fast, familiar, and free. And by that means, LifeSci Acquisition Corp is the SPAC that we ended up with, essentially what we call merging with. And so there's a company called LifeSci Acquisition Corp that's sitting up on NASDAQ. To Neil's point, they had money behind it. We raised the PIPE behind that, and then it flipped from NASDAQ as LifeSci Acquisition Corp to now SNCE on NASDAQ. So they are already an investor in Science37 from a previous round. So we knew who they were. They have an advisory where they have a relationship with more than 400 biotech companies already. And so they have, not only are they, familiar to us, but there's a lot of familiarity that they have with other companies that are also potential customers of ours. So it really extended our reach and our penetration into that advisory firm, and the companies that it represented within it. We also knew, because they had a relationship with us, that we could do this very quickly. And so speed was important for us. We wanted to raise a lot of money. very quickly because the market was hot and still is. And we wanted to have enough capital behind us in order to be able to grow and invest in the technology platform that we have already, and to keep up or to keep ahead of the market that we already created. And the last piece was about free. So there's a lot of SPACs out there, and Neil kind of went through a few of them, different structures of them. But there's something called a warrant that sits in a lot of these SPACs, which is almost a tax, if you will, that some of the pre-investors in that SPAC trust have for leverage as the company continues to grow. They could redeem their warrants, and that dilutes the company. And the SPAC that we chose had no public warrants associated with it at all. And so from an ease of transaction perspective, it's super, super good for us, just not to dilute the company as we went down this path.
And I think that was what we went through, which was we weren't looking at just one option, right? We were looking at additional private financing, quite frankly. And then from the public perspective, we were looking at a traditional IPO. We were looking at a variety of SPACs. I think at one point we had probably 5 SPACs plus engaged with us with different term sheets. And we ended up working with this LifeSci one, as mentioned, as one, they were a previous investor, as David mentioned. I think the other piece that was important to us was that component around, we want to ensure that whatever we're doing is best for the company, and best for all shareholders involved, right? And that involved in ensuring that we reduce dilution for everyone, including all of the common stockholders. And then the other piece is merging with a SPAC that allowed us to ensure that we would have the most number of guaranteed dollars for the company. And so from that perspective, we actually ended up going with the smallest SPAC that we had in the process, which was the LifeSci one. It was a $75 million SPAC, and we ended up raising a $200 million plus PIPE. And you're able to do that in the context of a really good company, right? The PIPE market is very hard and challenging because there's you have very sophisticated investors, and there's a price finding discovery process to getting a PIPE investor to commit, because it is a commitment. Whereas the SPAC trust piece is an option. It's more or less an option for those holders within the SPAC. And so I think the key for us was we had a very strong team, a very strong growth, and very strong story that resonated with the PIPE investors and allowed us to have that guaranteed capital. And I think, the elephant in the room, it was really, the degradation of the broader SPAC market, or what I would say is the overexuberance. There was obviously a lot of overexuberance, and you ended up having SPACs that were being formed by celebrities and other people that really didn't have a business in like creating SPACs and managing them, and very large SPACs with large warrants and no pipes that ended up getting fully redeemed. You had this over exuberance that made it challenging for a lot of companies. And I think no one, not even us, no one could have foreseen that level of growth and exuberance in that cycle. But I think for us, it was a matter of being disciplined and sticking to our discipline about choosing the right vehicle that made sense for us. And that's what we did. And even if in this current market, would we have made that same decision? I think the answer is yes, because it was the right decision for us, given the way that it was constructed. And that's always been my feedback to our portfolio companies, other CEOs we work with, is, don't lean into what you hear on the news. Do what's right for the company and really dive into the right mechanism. And in this case, this was the right choice for Science37.
I love this dialogue. I feel like we're getting a master class from 2 experts on how to think about capital acquisition and the SPAC market. If you'll bear with me, let me try to summarize again, just for everyone, what at least I just heard. So Science37 a year and a half ago is thinking about continuing to invest in its growth. It needs capital. It could either raise from the venture market, it could go public, or it could go public via a SPAC. And Dave, based on your comments, it just made sense to go the SPAC market, right? Because of the speed, the known potential investor, the cost of capital, et cetera, all those reasons. And then Neil, what I heard from you is that you need to be thoughtful about the design of the SPAC itself. And Dave, you mentioned this around the warrants as well. but to think about that the SPAC actually is it's access to capital on two sides. The capital that sits in trust in the company that's you're merging with, which actually has a fair bit of risk right now because that could all be redeemed, and usually it's all or nothing. And so even though there's this pot of gold in that SPAC, it's the pipe piece that you guys oriented yourself around. And if you trust the fact that you could raise private investment in a public entity, that pipe, right, that's a second but more resilient access to capital. And so those were the decision points, and you guys pulled it off beautifully. So Dave, tell me, it's not an easy choice to go public and to be now the CEO of a public entity. I'm curious, what's life like? Is it any different? Is it the same? And Neil, will come to you as well because you're now a board member as well. And so, Dave, tell us, like, what does it feel like? How's life changed?
Yeah, everybody's trying to scare me away from it. Actually, back in the day, oh, you don't want to be a CEO of a public company, but so far so good. I mean, we spent a little bit more time with investors than I had, but we also, prior to this, were on this cycle where we would go and have pitch cycles to go raise additional capital. But going after a large bucket of cash, you really take that issue away to apply it to having different conversations about long-term investment. And so in that perspective, it's a little bit different, but from a time suck perspective, which is really what I was afraid of, actually, not that bad. And, thankfully, knock on, something, to date, we've had the, pleasure of exceeding our numbers. Back when we originally did this, it was January, end of January, early February of 2021. We've reported 3 earnings cycles since then. We've got another one coming up here on the 22nd of March. But we've exceeded on every number that we came out with, and that's been very positive and led to really terrific conversations as a result.
And I think that the only other piece I would add is kind of to answer your question, Jeremy, as a board member, what's changed? If I would say that, there's some basic things that have changed on kind of reporting, and we have some new responsibilities we have to take care of being a public company board member. But in reality, what's really changed is just a continued growth and excitement in helping the company to deliver on this vision. We had access to additional capital to really drive growth, and it's allowed us to become more strategic on our discussions around where do we want to take this company. And so, if anything, I would say I've enjoyed the process even more, and I think that it's given us the ability to have even more in-depth conversations on not just incrementally adding innovation to this space, but really leapfrogging. What's the next best thing that we can do for patients? And it's allowed us to have the public profile to be able to take some of those big bets and drive the company in that direction. So if anything, I would say it's become even more exciting for us as board members and as a collective.
I really appreciate your comments. I've had some of the same fears, that when you go from private to public, all of a sudden it's exactly that. It's just now you're on full display. But what I hear from you is that being in full display, being a public company, actually, the accountability, the further accountability you have to the public and to your investors is actually more motivating and more meaningful, and is driving your success. So congratulations, you guys are doing a great job. I see Joe coming on board. I see a couple of questions, but Joe, take us in the direction that you want us. You want us to do wrap up or answer questions, or where would you like us to?
Absolutely. First of all, Jeremy, David, and Neil, thank you for that fascinating discussion. I think you guys covered a lot of ground, from the history of DCT to the success of Science37 and the SPAC deals as well. I think you guys have already taken up a few of the interesting questions, and I think they've received the answers as well. But one of the questions that I think you could definitely help us answer is, I think the one on patient engagement, especially remote patient engagement, is markedly different from in-person engagement. How do companies like Science37 manage this, and are there any learnings there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it comes down to the protocol and what we're trying to accomplish in the study. So it's if it's simple like vital sign check, it's really easy to do with a nurse in home. If it is going through a procedure, that's a referral into a local community provider. If it's just a one-on-one interaction through a video screen, also very simple, and it's just the way we exist in life today. And so it really hasn't been, I think it's disruptive to the industry, but from a patient perspective, I don't think it's weird. I think it's really welcomed.
Thank you for that, David. I think the final question that we could probably take up in another minute. Do you see any potential for positive DCT experiences to feed into greater uptake of digital health solutions when drugs launch on the commercial market? Any differences in interest level from pharma, patients, clinicians?
I think you have one potential of expanding the number of patients that you engage in clinical research. For one, I think for another would be having a relationship with some of these patients that is repeatable, where you might be able to take some of these patients and pull them into an alumni community, and then be able to engage them when the drug comes commercially available as well. And I think that's a big step that is missing in your traditional clinical trial. And that's all about, again, the misnomer of centralization versus decentralization. We have these relationships with these patients. And so when the drug does come commercially viable, that's a fairly easy communication back to the patient base.
David, if I could add to your comment, I think one, maybe also where this question is going is that a lot of the enabling technology that allows you to implement Science37, like solution, a decentralized or capability, is through novel technologies. And so, to the extent that we're successfully deploying these novel technologies in and through Science37, it creates basically the accelerated path to normalizing those kinds of technologies in the real world. And so I don't know if that's sort of where the question was, but I know that was oftentimes sort of our strategy in our innovation teams in pharma is all right, let's do remote monitoring. All remote monitoring would be a great way to get that endpoint in the trial. So if it works in the trial, why shouldn't it work in the real world?
Yeah. And then there's the extension to that too, Jeremy, which is about developing the digital biomarkers that, don't exist, haven't existed in the old world, but can exist in a new world, where you could use, how they utilize a device in order to be able to capture that commercially as well.
Great.
Thanks, David. Any final insights to share before we sign off from the webinar?
I think we kind of covered the gamut. I think we've got, hopefully today, opened up sort of the aperture of what decentralization can do. I think that thinking about it in a non-binary kind of way, where you could fluidly move from a traditional model to a decentralized model, I think an important consideration. But also, as you think about the utilization of decentralization, adds three really super important characteristics. One, about accelerating recruitment. Two, about maintaining your patients throughout the clinical trial through reducing their burden. And then three, getting the diversity that you need to fulfill not just the social issues, but scientific issues as the drug goes into a commercial environment. So you're seeing that happen on scale today, and we're super excited about that and expect to continue to do a lot more of it.
And I think the only piece, just wrapping up, I would say, is reach out if you have questions, or if you have a trial that you're not sure whether it makes sense to do in a DCT manner. For anyone that's on the webinar, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd love to just even have a discussion around what we've learned and how we can be helpful to you.
Yeah, I'm David.Coman at Science37.com. COMAN. There's no L or E. Common mistake. So David.Coman at Science37.com if you want to get a hold of me.
Thanks, David. Thanks for the clarification as well. I'm sure it'll help the team. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Jeremy, for the fascinating discussion today. Thank you for being here. Thank you everyone for that joined. We hope you enjoyed the session. Please definitely check out the HealthXL events page for the upcoming meetings, and hopefully we get to see you in the upcoming sessions. Thank you so much, everyone.